Get started. Good evening, my name is Kelly Arehart. I am the Manager of Interpretation of the George Washington Foundation. I got my PhD in American History from the College of William and Mary in 2014. And I worked for Colonial Williamsburg for 10 years before coming here. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you, mostly ladies, and a handful of gentlemen who are very good sports. This is the first in a series of lectures from the George Washington Foundation this May. The next one, next week, 7 o'clock, is tied to Fielding Lewis and his business. So it's about credit and the economy in 18th century America. In addition to that, we are also doing the following week, so the 15th at 7 o'clock, Curiosities from the Kenmore Collection. So we have one about that's tied to Betty, one that's tied to Fielding, and one that is about Kenmore as an organization and institution and the types of things that we have. So we hope that you'll join us for the others as well. I have to juggle a whole bunch of things in my hands, and I'm very upset I don't have pockets, which everyone laughs at, and I only can imagine 18th century women who had pockets, how they would rage at our clothing. Because it's very difficult to carry things around, of course, if you don't have your purse. So we're talking very generally about Betty Washington Lewis and the nature of women's health in the 18th century. I just want to start with an image of the lady herself. This is Betty Washington Lewis. She was, of course, the sister of George Washington, younger by about a year. At the age of, actually, just shy of 17, she marries Fielding Lewis, and together the two of them have 11 children. Unfortunately, only 6 of whom lived to adulthood. So if there's anything that Betty is going to be very familiar with, it's going to be 18th century reproductive health. It dictated a huge portion of her life. So this is stuff that she would be familiar with, and this is really a true tie to Betty and to the women and to other women who lived during the period. So one of the things that I've noticed is we don't know a lot about the specifics of her labor and delivery, what happens to some of the children, but we can put her in a broader context. We know what kinds of things doctors and midwives are doing. So we have a little bit of an insight into what she may have been experiencing through this portion of her life. One of the things that's sort of kind of amazing during this period is there's a huge change in the way medicine operates. She's born in 1733, and she dies in 1797. And there are a whole host of things that are going on during this time period that really inform the way people think about their bodies, the way that they understand what's happening to them during various stages of their life. And she would have experienced all of it, if not necessarily firsthand at different points in her life, through all of the other women that she would have known, her mother, Mary, who's older, and as well as her own daughter, who's also named Betty, Harriet, who comes to live with them, one of the other Washington nieces. So she would have been dealing with all of these different issues and elements throughout her lifetime. When we talk about women's health in this particular context, we're going to really be talking. Hello. Okay. We're really going to be talking about women, particularly their reproductive health. And one of the reasons for that is, as we know still today, women are just as susceptible as the types of diseases as men are. Now, of course, we also know today that they...
No.
Hello?
Oh.
They're just as susceptible. Of course, today we also know that. She's closing the door.
Yeah.
Well, part of it's also for the filming, because Zach's in the back filming. You're right. I can project just fine. That's not the problem. So, I mean, I can continue to speak. Can you hear me? Do you think I'll be okay?
Be all right.
Okay, I'll be fine. Thank you. That makes me feel so much better. That's one less thing I have to juggle. Thank you, ladies. So we know that women are just as susceptible to the same diseases. Of course, at that time, they don't necessarily recognize all the nuances that we know about now. But honestly, we didn't know about some of those nuances till relatively recently, in terms of how women respond to heart disease. We know that there are symptoms that are different than men. And it wasn't until they started doing actual trials on women in the 1990s that we had this information. So they understand that they have the same diseases. The manifestation looks different. And they only can understand that to such a point because they don't have the medical technology we have now. It's important to remember that women's reproductive health is not the end-all be-all of their health, of course. There's issues, of course, with cancer and other types of diseases during the 18th century. But it's a really important part of their identity. I mean, this is a huge part of what Betty Washington Lewis is as a mother, as a woman who was constantly pregnant. So it makes sense within this sort of broader context. The thing that's important to keep in mind is that each stage of life, particularly in this instance reproductive life, is seen as perilous. It's seen as dangerous. It's seen as an opportunity for something really, really bad to happen. And to be fair, a lot of these stages, there was that possibility. There still is now. So what are we talking about today in terms of the specific? So we're talking women's reproductive health, and these are sort of the main elements we're going to cover. The first is onset of menarche, which is pre-puberty, basically, for young ladies. You don't usually, you'll see that I have periodical issue, which is what you hear more often than what we commonly think of it, period. So if I say menses or courses or menarche, you know what I'm talking about, because a lot of these terms are really old-fashioned. Pregnancy, of course, being very key to women, to Betty and other women like her. Childbirth, which is probably the most perilous of perilous times for women, not only in the 18th century, but today, in terms of their reproductive lifetime. Cessation of the menses, which we now call menopause. We'll talk a little bit about that. The last thing I really want to spend some time on is something that I think is absolutely fascinating, is clothing and women's reproductive health. Because they do see a connection between them. They understand that what they're wearing can influence the various issues that's listed above. This is just a picture of a satirical image from the 18th century of a couple going to a doctor. Some of the images are just people, because some of the alternative images are not really suitable for public. But in this case, what I really want you to kind of get out of this is where it comes down to the way they understand the body has changed in a pretty short period of time. And because of that change, it actually informs everything you'll see in terms of treatment for ailments during each stage of a woman's reproductive life. So that's going to include things like, and the biggest thing is that's beginning to shift in a major way, is the way they understand sort of what's going on inside their body. For the longest time in the Western world, there was something called Galenic theory. Galen, who was a doctor coming out of the golden age of Greece. And he was the one who said, have you ever heard of humors? The biles and the blood and the phlegm, yeah. So, but that actually takes hold for a really, really long time throughout the Western world. When we get into the 17th, 16th, 17th, and certainly in the 18th century, they're thinking about it differently. What had happened before this point in the mid-1700s, a guy named William Harvey had figured out how the circulation system worked. And when he figured that out, it meant everything else that they had thought about Galenic theory can't be right. Now the thing about doctors is they are conservative in their treatments. So even though this is the cutting edge of medical science in the 1600s, it doesn't necessarily, it's embraced right away. So even though he's 1628 and Betty's born in 1733, but this is still an ongoing process. That's probably one of the biggest things that you begin to see differently.
if you read an 18th century medical treatise of any kind, well, of almost all kinds, if they use the word humor, they're not talking about bile or blood or phlegm. They're talking about body fluids. So they're using some of the words, and actually they continue to use some of the treatments, but they're beginning to fundamentally shift. And this fundamental shift influences the way women are treated when they're sick, especially if they're having difficulties at various points. What you see, and this is a holdover, so they're thinking different, but they're doing a lot of the same things. Things like bleeding, which we all kind of go, oh my God. So they are bleeding pregnant women, they are bleeding children. To us is absolutely abhorrent. But to them, their understanding of the body is such that it's almost like a machine. 18th century is a very mechanical age. It's almost like a machine. And when the machine overheats, you got to do something to release the heat. Removing some blood will release the heat, or so they think. Basically, instances where there are concerns about inflammation is when they're doing this. In addition to that, they're also going to do some other things as well. I used to work at the apothecary shop at Colonial Williamsburg, and one of my favorite things to explain to small children was upward purges and downward purges. I will not explain it beyond that because I think you understand. Once again, the same idea. You're taking the heat out of the body. So when I was reading these, and the way I actually pulled most of the stuff, my sources for this particular talk were treatises that were designed for women to read at home. So the kind of thing, ladies, you would have in your house. Your mother probably had one before you. You're probably going to give one to your daughter. May not be up to date. Doesn't matter. You can give her anyway. So this is the kind of thing that this is information they're sharing via different generations, and they're sharing sort of across friendships as well. There's a lot of sharing in 18th century women's reproductive lives, and I'll talk about that as we go through. So we'll start with the first step. So that onset of menarche, initial period. This is just an image of a very pretty young lady who's about the right age. What happens very often during this period, the doctors during the period recognize this, is that menarche onset is somewhere between 13 and 16. Pretty close to the same. One of the amazing things about all of this is more or less our bodies actually function the same way. Just the way they understood their body versus the way we understand our body is really different. So it's one of these things where, somewhere between 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there. We're a little earlier now. I think 13 is considered the average. They give advice in these manuals, which is kind of why you read them, right, for their advice. And they give advice that's going to sound very familiar. Wholesome food, exercise, and not getting too worked up. Any of you have ever dealt with a teenage girl? There you go. My favorite part is they kind of say, they're like, not only not get worked up, but especially about boys. Like, just kind of hold them in. During this period, they want healthy, robust young women. Actually, through the course of their lives, they want healthy, robust women. This isn't the 19th century where everyone's supposed to be pale and thin and wan and sickly. 18th century people don't have any time for that. There's too much going on. And this is going to be true across the spectrum. You want everybody to be healthy, regardless of where they are in a social status, whether they're free or enslaved, because it serves the greater purpose, which is producing more people, essentially. Sorry. I used to do this I lectured. I taught at William and Mary on and off for about 7 years when I was working on my dissertation. And I would go all the way around the room, and I would yell and I would scream, and then I go, wait, where am I? So I apologize for that. All right, so there are. There she is. So menarche, of course, has its challenges. This is still true today. It's from the 18th century. Modern medical historians think that 18th century women only had about 10 periods a year. And there's a number of potential reasons for this. The reason why we expect that women menstruate like 13 times a year is because of, diet and access to medicine and sort of the way we manage stress and all of these different things. That was not really an option to them. And I'm not quite sure what their methodology was, but this seems to have been really picked up by the history of medicine community. The other thing that becomes interesting about the way they understand their bodies and menstruation is the possibility of having what they call a menstrual blockage. Because there's an understanding that you're supposed to get it fairly regularly, right? They know that. And if they go through a period of time and for whatever reason it doesn't come, they'll take things to essentially clear out a menstrual blockage. Part of that has to do with the fact that they don't understand conception the way we do. And legally, it's usually not thought of as pregnancy until the woman quickens. So about 5 months, you can feel the baby moving around. So before that, there's sort of this weird, nebulous point, which to us is very, very strange, but in part it's tied to the fact that they don't know as much as we do, thanks to modern medical science. So some of the things, so they take what are known as amenagogues. So chamomile is an amenagogue. So is parsley in large. I did not know that. Parsley in large amounts as well. The other issue too. Oh wait. So there's the illnesses that are associated with this. So this is the thing you want to kind of clear things out. The idea being you're not getting it enough, or you're getting too little. Of course, you have the opposite too with heavy flow. They call it menstrual flux. And guess what they do to treat it? Based on what I said earlier, it's nothing weird. Bleed them, upward purge, downward purge. And when you read these advice manuals over and over and over again, it's a variation of the exact same treatment. But they recognize that as being a problem. In addition to that, they talk about hysteria. They know the womb doesn't float around. There's one of the manuals from 1740 talks about it being, the ligaments and all. I mean, there was a clear understanding of anatomy by the guy who was writing this piece. So they know it's not floating around, but they do still think it's the cause of certain issues. When you read the symptoms that link together, it's baffling. So it's things like passing out, okay, sort of mood swings, okay, pains in the back of the head, okay, and it just becomes this weird list. Some of them actually are familiar to us and are probably a variation of, not necessarily mental illness, but what we call sort of PMDD today. When you read some of the symptoms, and then it's like ones that it's like uncontrollable falling down. I don't think that's a. But I mean, once again, it's that idea of how they understand the body. To them, they all get lumped, whether the reason they're associated with each other is what they think or not. The last question, I used to get this question all the time, had to do with sanitation. Because during the period, women, for the most part, are not wearing undergarments on the lower half of their bodies. So the question becomes, what are they doing? And there's a host of things. We don't know as much about this as we'd like. Medical historians don't know this. They're like, I don't know how much you want to know. Sorry, I didn't think of that just then. Part of it is there's speculation that their flows were lighter. Once again, tied to that issue of diet and stress and strenuous activity and all those sorts of things. There's evidence that they used sort of rewashable rags, basically excess cloth from something or another. Makes sense. We think that there's also the possibility that it was used in a sort of a sanitary napkin kind of way, think belt, which kind of gone now, but I mean, that's a concept. I always appreciate that when women are like, I don't know what that is. Because younger women usually do. Other thing too, and this is the one that I find the most distressing and is absolutely bizarre by modern standards. The basic piece of underclothing women do wear is called a shift. And it's basically just a white nightgown, cotton or linen. that goes usually from around your elbow-ish, and then it goes down about your knee-ish, depending, and it's just loose. And there are instances where we have, it's recorded, where women talk about, oh, just their shift absorbed. Once again, to us, that's absolutely unbelievable, because by our standards, that's so unsanitary. What? I mean, if this is what the women are choosing to do, that's what they're choosing to do. And I think it's really interesting and important to remember just sort of how our idea of hygiene has changed, especially in that regard. So that gives you a little bit of an information about the process of the onset and sort of some of the issues surrounding menses. I think it's such a cute picture. So the thing about pregnancy, once again, that idea, it's perilous. Wholesome food, exercise, don't get worked up, manage your stress. Sound familiar? One of the things that you see, particularly earlier in the century, they talk about how you shouldn't go to the gallows. This is actually in London, they're writing this. Don't go to the gallows when you're pregnant. Like, don't go watch. It'll upset you. So, I mean, but to them, all right, that's the stress. Got it. You have a kind of an idea of what they're counting as stress. This is very, very difficult in the sense of likelihood of dying goes up with each pregnancy. Percentage, it climbs and it climbs and it climbs. She's pregnant 11 times. It's kind of miraculous she manages to do this. But she, like her mother Mary, are of tough constitution. So it's not terribly surprising that she's able to kind of keep moving through all of this. And that idea that pregnancy is recognized as wanted, but it's also terrifying. Women recognize every time that this happens, when they realize through whatever way they know, because every woman has a different thing every time they're pregnant. My mom's was, anytime she smelled coffee, which was her favorite thing to drink, she knew she was pregnant. You know, that moment, it's like, here we go. Because for Betty, you don't know what's going to happen at the end. And I can't even imagine the stress of that. In terms of pregnancy, the complications. Most pregnancy complications during the period are actually the same that we experience now, but they can't treat them in a way that we think of as efficacious, because they just don't have the ability to tell. For example, it's one of these things that you need microscopes, and you need x-rays, and you need all of these things, and you need germ theory to be able to take care of, say, an ectopic pregnancy. You can't do that. Similarly with preeclampsia, same sort of thing. They can bleed, but beyond that, there's not a lot they can do. So when we talk about even pregnancy, we think usually 18th century, it's childbirth. Childbirth is the thing. But pregnancy is just as dangerous. And it's something I think collectively we don't think about. Which is funny, because today we acknowledge how potentially dangerous pregnancy is. So pregnancy, childbirth is really scary for a number of reasons. One of the reasons why it is so scary is because going in, you're going to be in a tremendous amount of pain. There is no anesthetic. They don't give you alcohol, gives you a chance of hemorrhaging, right? Makes the blood thin. They don't give you opium, so opium's expensive, and they actually don't really think of it very often as its primary purpose being a painkiller. So at that moment, when you smell that coffee, what's waiting for you in the pregnancy? Bed. I shouldn't say bed, because they do walk around to kind of facilitate carrying. And the other thing, too, there's that possibility that both the mother and the child, or one or the other, isn't going to survive. We see this with Fielding's first wife, Catherine Washington. She gives birth to 2 children who live to, one we know grows up. I don't have the other one. Actually, we don't know that. Anyway, the last one, though, she delivers, and baby doesn't make it, and shortly thereafter, neither does she. So Fielding knows this, going into this situation with Betty. I mean, that's the other thing, too, is we don't usually talk about sort of the men involved in this process, but, I mean, it's scary, especially if you're attached to your wife. So that process of, I love it when I write something down and, oh, wow. There's also all kinds of complications that we still have now, but a lot of them can be addressed very quickly in a modern hospital room. So things like anal fissures, which of course happen during delivery, can be treated immediately. It's not the case in the 18th century. If it doesn't heal right, you're going to develop other issues, both reproductively and other parts of the body. So all kinds of things that to us is it's like, okay, we just swab this down and we sew it up. Not an option for 18th century women. So it's one of these things where you see, so why did they stop having kids? And it's like, well, I mean, she could have gone through menopause. She could have had some sort of infection, which when you start really following this, you get a sense of, wow, that's a high likelihood. So you get a sense of sort of there's only so much they can do, which is frustrating. There's a host of people in the room too. So this isn't a purely clinical process yet. So you're going to have midwives, friends and family may be there as well, especially mom and mother-in-law. It's not uncommon for them to be there too. The midwife could be white or enslaved or a free black woman. All of that happens regularly in the sense of anybody who has demonstrated they can do this well is considered of value to do it in this situation. Because guess what? None of the rest of it matters when we got to deliver a baby. The interesting thing about that too is the ones who are good at it are really proud of being good at it. There's a woman in Williamsburg, Virginia, who takes out an ad in the Virginia Gazette where she says she's delivered 3,000 babies. I know, right? I was like, how is that even possible? Did you start when you were 6? Which of course would not be the case. There are, of course, apprentices to midwives, and that's its own process. But what begins to happen is by the second half of the century, you begin to see man midwives, and that's the term they use, man midwives. And the interesting thing about them is when they would go to school overseas, particularly Scotland, and this is like ground zero of the Enlightenment, particularly for medicine. So they begin to give out this sort of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, they give out certificates saying, yes, this guy can deliver babies even though he gets no opportunities to practice. You want the midwife with 3,000 or do you want the guy with a piece of paper? And that's something that the women during the period have to begin to decide, particularly, say, for Betty towards the end of her childbearing years. I like this image because it actually tells us a lot. So the idea being that a man midwife is not really a man at all. He's sort of this weird in-between guy. Then on this side, they're talking about the virtues of a actual midwife, in the sense that it's homey. There's like a hearth, and she's got something comforting in her hand, and like it just looks comfortable and inviting. Meanwhile, on his side, this is cold and about as clinical as you get for this time period. Not only that, he's bringing in some of the tools that they're developing during this time. And this is one of the big criticisms about these man midwives, is that they're bringing in these things up here that are all used, look at this stuff, used to deliver a baby. Yeah. No wonder women didn't want to give up the midwives. So it's one of these things. So some of them are familiar. You got a forceps. I actually don't know what this does. I don't want to know. This is used in a horrible way that I'm not going to go into. But you get the sense when you look at it, they're telling you this guy is unnatural, this guy is a butcher, and you don't want to have anything to do with him. So to us, it's kind of a neat looking image, but it's actually conveying a lot of information to an 18th century viewer. They'd be able to follow this without too much trouble. So one of the biggest things that come in, during this time are forceps. They begin to use forceps in a major way, and forceps look like what you think forceps look like. They're very similar to the ones that you're aware of in recent decades. There is a lot of potential problems with forceps, especially at this point because they don't completely have it all figured out. I'm going to read you some of the list. It's horrifying. So for the baby, it's things like bumps and bruises, facial nerve injury, brain hemorrhage, resulting in death. One of the other things, too, that I think is interesting, so the idea is that if the neck twists too much, that ocular nerves can be damaged, which causes a big cross-eye. Yeah, I like that you're like, I know what that means! Fielding Lewis had essentially a crossed eye, came out this way. And I wonder that during a regular childbirth, that he probably wasn't delivered with forceps, that his neck twisted, and that's exactly what happened. I don't know that, I can't prove it, but it's sort of a fascinating thought that we can put something that we don't know very much about and tie it to another concept, even if I am. So there's a whole bunch of things that also can happen to the mother. Pelvic organ prolapse, incontinence, long and painful recovery, and difficulty going to the bathroom during recovery. So it is a host of really painful, really awkward, terrible things that can happen through this delivery. So you can see why this whole issue is thought of as very important during this time. And there's a cachet to having a doctor deliver, but remember, he's rolling in with this stuff. Once again, him, lady 3,000. Exactly. I mean, that's sort of the thing. So it becomes clear to women who are delivering. But once again, it's just like now, it's a decision you have to make, right? Every woman makes a decision for her own, what we now call birth plans, right? What is it that she wants to happen, in what order? Where does she want to deliver? Does she want to doula? All that stuff. That idea of being a participant in the process is very much the case in the 18th century in a way you don't see in parts of the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is really important. And I like it because it's refreshing. We think of them as being so different from us in so many ways. And they are. But that there are things about them that we can really connect to. And I find that really exciting. All right, so this is the part that I always get really excited about, is the clothing in reproductive health. And it's one of these things where some of the concepts in it are very familiar in terms of what you wear under what kind of circumstances and what situations. So these are the three, and you kind of look at some of them and you're like, why is that even an issue? But I'll explain in a second. So the first we'll talk about is menarche and the onset of menarche. One of the things that you find in a lot of the advice manuals is that they talk about the girls, young ladies, girls, shouldn't be laced too tightly into their stays. Stays are the support garment for women in the 18th century. Once again, they're not Victorian, so that idea of having a wasp waist is not what they're going for, unless they're sort of a fashionista type. So this is something that's actually explicitly warned against for girls who are going through puberty. I think part of that might also be cultural. The interesting thing about some of this is it's part physiological and it's part cultural. In that, you're right, it's not good for you to do this. Okay. Well, there might be another concern here, right? If she's going to get herself all dolled up and dress in this provocative way, she can get herself in trouble. So there's that cultural element too. And I can't prove that part, but it makes sense because they're the same sort of tropes you see when you talk about the bigger issues about sort of young women and their behavior around men. I was trying to think of a way to say that neatly. So that's one of the things that's interesting to keep in mind, that a lot of this is cultural. It's not all physical. So that's a good idea in general. I have a pair of stays. I know there's a number of people here who wear 18th century costume. You don't want to tight lace those things. You really don't. So during pregnancy, goes back to that idea of stays. Remember, this is the undergarment that underpins sort of the silhouette of an 18th century woman. one of the things that you probably notice here, so there's this in the back, right, which is what we saw with the woman before, right? She's being laced up in the back. So we've got the back going, and then we have the sides. And the idea being that you let out more and more as the baby grows. A friend of mine actually portrays Martha Washington for Colonial Williamsburg, and she had a baby. She couldn't really, that was, she had a baby and she was in costume. And she wore pregnancy stays at work. And we said, how were they? And she said, they're great. She goes, you get great back support. You get, I mean, she's like, your range of motion is limited, which is the good thing. And in this situation, she was just thrilled about this. So it's interesting because it's one of those things we look at and go, oh, that's a torture device. And the answer is, it's not. It's actually it's efficacious by our standards in that it provides sort of all that kind of support you would want during pregnancy. And they're fascinating. They're not all exactly the same. That one's sort of down the middle. There are ones that have it in the front and the back in the middle. It just depends. But the most important thing is that they can grow, essentially. Which I think is really clever. So we've got a pregnancy outfit. Doesn't she look cute? But the thing that you'll notice is it's similar to the kinds of things women wear when they're not pregnant. Right? I mean, if she didn't have, if she wasn't showing, that's something an 18th century woman would wear, right? So this idea that you have to hide when you're pregnant is once again, Victorian idea. They live their lives as they gotta live their lives, right? They like to wear things that look good. They wear things that fit with the fashion. They lend their clothes to each other. All the women go, yeah. They lend their pregnancy clothes to each other, which makes a lot of sense. We do it now. I like this about them, in part because it shows us that we weren't always stuffy Victorians. And the whole you have to hide, you have to hide. When I gave the talk at Chancellor Village, I had a number of women who came up after who had had children in the 40s and 50s and said, we don't go out. We didn't go out. We didn't go out in public. And they said, we wore these big shirts and we just, but they're not like this. They're not like this at all. So this is another sort of interesting spot where we see a completely different way of thinking emerge. The last is going to be during, I'll talk about it then. I realize I didn't get to cessation of the menses, and I'll do that with this lovely lady up. The term menopause is actually not coined until the 1820s in Germany. So during this time, it really is cessation of the menses, a change in life. The other thing that's sort of interesting in the medical texts, medical treatises, is that whenever they talk about something affecting different groups of women at different stages in their life, it's maid, mother, widow. They always call her a widow. And they're talking about certain things that have to are tied to menopause. The language is widow. During the period, they recognize menopause to set in between the ages of about 40 and 50. They recognize the symptoms as we would. So things like hot flashes, irritability, internal dryness. They're actually pretty observant during this period. When they're doing this stuff, and they give this advice, some of it's fairly, in terms of what they're describing, I don't recommend you start taking mercury, because somebody's a little late. But the nature of what their observations are really, really impressive. Through the whole process, from the young ladies through the process of what we now call menopause. And once again, guess what the general advice is? Wholesome food, exercise, manage your stress. I like that one because it's like, and I like that they had a finger on that in the 18th century. They realized that for women, these are things, well, and for everyone, really, because in other medical treatises, they talk about everybody should be getting exercise, fresh air, good food, what they consider good. That helped a lot. There she is. I know. So that's sort of interesting that, once again, place is the same. One of the things you find with women who are menopausal in terms of and postmenopausal in terms of their clothing, and this is to a certain extent cultural, right? So we had, don't look like a harlot when you're young. You're allowed to be fashionable when you're pregnant, and then when you're older, there's sort of this attitude, and it's a collective thing. You don't necessarily wear the latest fashions. You can. No one's going to say you shouldn't or you can't. But what you begin to see in a lot of images of older women in the 18th century, actually 19th and into the 20th century, they wear clothes from when they were younger. The style of what they wear. I mean, all of the women, it's like if I met a woman who is in her 60s, I'm not expecting to walk in and see her wearing, a pair of bell-bottoms. And right, we just kind of went, that's ridiculous. Who does that? And the answer was, they did a variation of this. And it sounds impossible. And how different could it be? Fashion's changed every decade. Because of this, you can kind of begin to sort of be like, all right, I know when you were young. And so women sort of represent this. Men do it too, though. There's a poem in the early 19th century, it takes place in England, where a young man is writing about, just like how good it is to be young. And he writes in the poem this whole thing about how he sees a man in breeches and a wig. And he's writing this in the 1820s. Well, that tells us, it definitely tells the audience, that guy's old. Because he hasn't set, he's stuck with what he had. And actually, into the 20th century, for a long, long time, he did this. I think much to the relief of everybody. As times change, you kind of change with them. Because there's all those things you regret wearing when you're young. So to sort of to conclude, and we'll do questions in a minute. The world in which Betty Washington Lewis lived was one of constant change during this time period where you're talking about man midwives or what people are wearing or any of those parts. She is experiencing things very, very similar to other women who are just like her. And that she sees it from a number of places, right? She's got a daughter, she has a mother, she goes through all this process herself. The thing that I like about this time period, when we talk about women's reproductive health, sounds like weird that you'd have something you'd like, is that basically they became a community of women through this process. There was always someone to talk to. There was the mother, there might be a mother-in-law, there might be aunts, there might be neighbors, but the idea is that that information is shared and seen as important and not just swept under the rug. I would really like to see a variation of that come back, because I think there are so many women who want to tell stories and there's so many women who want to hear them in preparation. Well, I'm out of pages. So, yes?
How old was Betty when she had her first child, and how old was she when she had her last?
She was 17 with the first child, 36, I think, last? Yeah, somewhere in there, mid to late 30s.
This one woman, I can't remember her last name, but it's Mercy something or other. And she is during the same period. And she had a number of children, half of them died. But they said in the book that she did not become attached to the children because of the emotional thing.
She a New Englander.
Yes, she was.
There is a longer tradition in New England, coming out of the Puritan faith and the Congregationalist. This idea of you don't get too attached, that language of the little stranger. It exists here, and people are careful, but it's not sort of the same major process the way it is for, I would say, for Virginia women. Because you see a lot of sources from the period, from New England, where they kind of do this whole like, oh yeah, they died, and it's, now they've gone to be with God. So, does that answer your question at all? Okay. I know that's a weird answer. The answer is blame it on the New Englanders.
You mentioned early about having a menstrual blockage.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that do you believe may be the euphemism of I'm late? I need to bring forth my menstrual flow.
Probably a fair amount. I mean, I can't give you a percentage or a number, but but that's a really important point. It's like, all right, so what's really going on here? Are they concerned? Is this like what's the actual concern?
Is it euphemism or is it?
Or are they worried that it's like, oh no, something's really wrong with me, I'm sick? Or, like you said.
Have they picked up that sex-induced children for birth?
Do they know that sex is tied to pregnancy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They do. They very much do. Yeah. They actually know all kinds of impressive things. So, for example, yes, they know that. They also know things like minutia of pregnancy. So things like the mucosal plug. They know what that is. And they actually describe it in terms we would say, yeah, okay, that's exactly the way I would describe it now. So the thing, it's sort of interesting. They know more than we think they would, but they can't know as much as we do. And part of that's just technological. Part of it is also cultural.
Did they understand early miscarriages?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, they understood that process of miscarrying. Yes. Absolutely. Dave?
So colonials and Anglican colonials, they have a proper way to die, and then they have a proper way to, when you become 5 and you take on your clothing change and you go from an infant to a child. Does that work the same for pregnancy?
For what?
For pregnancy?
Yeah.
Is that
I mean, it's like you said, it's
is
this idea
there
of you're going through these
correct way?
steps.
There's a
in life.
correct way where if you're a good Anglican, you'll do this, this, and this.
Yeah. I mean, there is this, and that, yes, that informs the whole thing. And it's important to keep in mind that the religious element colors a lot of this in terms of the way they react to things. Whether it's the husband saying, "Thank God," I thank God for carrying my wife through. My wife and child through this process. Or I mean, the thing is, but yeah, a lot of it is couched in some way, and that idea of there's a progression, and that progression is supposed to happen a certain way. At the same time, they're very observant, and they realize it doesn't always quite actually. But the expectation is you're going to do what you can to sort of follow that line. Yes, ma'am.
Did they, like normal pregnancy is 40 weeks, but back then, how would they know if the baby was, like if they had to wait until they actually felt the baby, how did they know when the baby was at term?
Well, so we count from conception, right? Basically what you'll do is you count from that moment of quickening. You know what I mean? At this point, they understand that it's 9 months total, and it's like, all right, well, if this is what's happening to them at this stage, and we know women at this stage usually go X amount of time longer, we can kind of figure out what. Yeah, they just have a different starting point. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, it would happen that during the course of birth, like a woman had a pretty serious tear.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't stitch it, just either she healed or she
Well,
died.
the thing is, if they could do something, if it was clear they could do something to intervene,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, they would
something
try.
on her, or otherwise she just leave it.
Well, yeah, you have to do something, right? You got to stop the hemorrhage.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that's going to
Yeah.
be something that they're gonna have to do.
Right.
That's not a scary or problematic surgery from the perspective of they're not cutting into the body. right? I mean, it's external, essentially. So it is definitely, it's well, because the thing is, in general, during this period, they do not like to cut inside the body if they can help it. They'll perform mastectomies, they'll perform cataracts, and a handful, and of course, amputations. But that's, you know what I mean, that's something that'll happen. What happens is, in the 19th century, there is a doctor, J. Marion Sims, who basically just figures out how to do an episiotomy. The thing about that is, though, he used, before the Civil War, he used enslaved women. After the Civil War, he went up to New York, and he used black women, and he used Irish women right off the boat. So these are people who are not consenting to do this. I don't know if you've been following it. He actually had a statue in Central Park that they took out. And in that case, that guy was a butcher.
Is this the guy who's obsessed with fistulas?
Yes, he's obsessed with fistulas. Because the problem is, when you have a fistula, it's never going to heal beyond a certain point, right? You've got this kind of hard tissue. And it causes leakage. So it creates problems for relieving oneself, and it creates problems for conception. But yeah, I mean, it's like one of these things, like, okay, the way that he did it, you kind of go, and you're like, oh, that's a terrible thing to
So that picture of the woman getting dressed, what is the monkey?
Do you remember what the, because, all right, so we're going to go back to it. Nah, I keep doing that. There we go. The monkey, let's find the monkey. There he is. He's pointing at something. Usually when you see things like monkeys and sometimes certain types of dogs, it means folly. You know what I mean? It means like basically folly or frivolity or pointlessness. I don't know what it is. It's funny, years ago I knew. He's pointing at something in that book, but I can't remember what it is. But usually when you see these kind of animal shows, oh, do you know?
I think I do. If I remember this one correctly, you're exactly right. He represents folly or ridiculously, and he's pointing at a fashion magazine.
Oh.
So the whole point of the image is, this is ridiculous.
Every member of the household is in there.
Yes.
What was the name of that statue, the name of the doctor that was doing
J. Marion Sims.
it? And then, did you say that they were performing vasectomies?
No, mastectomies.
Oh,
I was saying that would become really impressive.
Kind of like, wow, that's.
No. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Speaking of vasectomies, I know that they had sheepskin type condoms,
yes.
prophylactics. What were they using for family planning at that time? I imagine, there had to be some things they were doing. If you didn't want to conceive.
One is one that has been advocated by the Roman Catholic Church in the past. It's still considered fairly common. It's the idea that the man would not ejaculate inside the woman.
Are you seeing things like pessaries or?
There are some attempts at stuff like that, but it's not like a major.
It's more word of mouth.
It's more, yeah. Basically, the idea that something like a diaphragm type thing. I don't know that much about it actually, but I know that would probably be the most common and most convenient of ways. Because that's the other thing too, right? What do you do when you don't want to be left pregnant for the 12th time? And the thing is, I've seen a few 18th century, but I've seen a lot of 19th century sources where they're like, he needs to stay away. I don't want to, ever. No. There's too many. So then that's the other concern, right? I mean, in any instance, there's always that possibility. And from that possibility, there's the possibility of the thing that makes you realize you're pregnant, to knowing that you're going to be in a tremendous amount of pain, that's the thing, to the possibility you're not going to survive. So it's understandable that these women are terrified in many of these situations. That's an awesome question. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you. The next one in our series that are all tied to Kenmore is about coinage and credit in the 18th century. He's supposed to be doing it half as Fielding Lewis and half as himself. See? It's my husband. He's 15 years at Colonial Williamsburg, and he's done first person work for a long, long time. But he kept saying, I don't know if I want to do that. I'm like, I don't care. And then after that, it is the lovely and talented Megan, our curator, who will be talking about some really awesome things in the collection. Thank you.